Any student thinks that 3 or 4 years is forever and they can just take it easy. Well, they can't, because it soon goes by.
I think and that goes back to Newton and Einstein. I mean, if you don't have differing views, you're not getting anywhere. And you might miss out a few geniuses. But they'll find their way, because they always do. Despite us, we're institutional. They're
My name is Ronny Gunnarsson and I am a general practitioner. Over the past 15 years I have partially worked with research and supervision of PhD students. I wanted to improve myself as a supervisor, and therefore I interviewed supervisors and PhD students. All interviews were videotaped and it was about 6 hours feedstock. All thoughts and ideas expressed could be categorized and sorted into 3 main topics. The first topic, the good example, how to prevent and manage problems in the relationship between PhD students and supervisors so that their relationship will be as good as possible. The second topic, disagreements are mostly okay. Disagreements between PhD student and supervisors occurs. Although it may feel uncomfortable, it is mostly okay. The third topic, the new PhD education. What changes have taken place in the PhD education and where will it end? What are the strengths and weaknesses with the ongoing changes? Let us now see and hear the thoughts that emerged in the interviews regarding the third topic, the new PhD education. What changes have taken place in the PhD education and where will it end? What are the strengths and weaknesses with the ongoing changes? What was it like to undergo PhD training in the past compared to now? What happened on the way?
Själv hade jag ju aldrig någon formell handledning. Jag startade, kan jag säga, mitt avhandling efter 1968-69 års undersökning då, alltså för, ja det blir för 40 år sedan, stämmer det? 40, ja. Och då fick man ju för sig goda råd av olika kollegor, men det var ju ingen som var formell handledare. Utan jag fick ju se till att jag försökte att komma på vad jag ville göra själv och så vidare. Och det fungerade ju också bra. Och det är kanske egentligen vad man kan tänka om en forskare, att han ska lära sig att forska själv. För nu är det ju formaliserat på ett helt annat vis. Sen kan man väl säga då att på 70- och 80-talet var det synnerligen starka krav på avhandling, både kvalitet och kvantitet. Det är ju numera inte samma krav på kvantitet, det skulle vara snarare tvärtom, så får det inte vara för långt nästan. Och när det gäller kvalitativ så är det ju inte samma hårda omdömen. Jag har inte varit med på någon avhandling på de senaste 10 åren där det har varit sån diskussion som det var på 70- och 80-talet. Så det tycker vi ändrar sig på ett attityd. Och nu är det ju nästa, då var det väldigt stor krav på att det skulle bli en bra forskning. Nu är det mer kanske krav på att det ska bli en bra forskarutbildning.
PhD education and subsequent dissertation was originally to a lesser extent an education, but more an acceptance of one's own extensive work. Over time, PhD education formalized more and more to be a carefully regulated education. Is this change good?
För verksamheten, alltså för den verksamhet som jag representerar då, universitetet, så är det ju viktigt att den tidsplan man har också hålls.
My expectation is that it will become increasingly an expectation that you submit stage reports. And in some ways, I have to say, with my experience, I think that's probably quite a good idea, because it then provides both the supervisor and the student with a real incentive to ensure that they're hitting their deadlines.
Doktorandutbildningen har blivit kvalitetssäkrad, kan man säga, av de här förändringarna som har skett. Man vet nu vad det står för. Och så när någon disputerar nu, då är det egentligen klart. Nu är det egentligen tillräckligt granskat på vägen, alla delarbeten, alla seminarier och så, kurser. Så att det har, men det har också inneburit att det blivit mer som en regelrätt utbildning. Jag menar då att originaliteten är inte alltid lika stor nu som den var tidigare. Och det tror jag är bra, för jag tror det viktiga är att man får en utbildning så att man kan forska. Och så får man göra lite avkall på originaliteten. Och det tror jag delvis är en konsekvens av den förändringen som har skett.
Det är så många nu och det är så... För att det ska föra framåt så måste man sätta ner kontrollstationer under resans gång. Men det finns också en byråkratisering av det som... Alltså man har tappat det här lite förståelsen för det personliga, tycker jag, som ligger i doktorandhandledarskapet och man måste det behöver inte vara, man måste kunna lita på handledaren lite mer, tycker jag. Nu finns det väl, man ska gå kurser och man ska vara godkänd handledare för att kunna vara handledare. Sånt där. När det är stora kullar och allting ska gå så är det väl bra, men någonting går förlorat och ibland är det frågan om det går mer förlorat än man vinner på det.
Many seem to think that the clearer structure of the PhD education with regular checks are good. At the same time, the medal might have a downside. Let's hear some ideas describing the downside.
Perhaps the extra burden that the students face now in terms of additional courses and additional requirements from the university to complete a PhD may make it more difficult for them to develop in the right way rather than helping them. But, I'm sure the university would disagree.
Att forskarutbildning nu är mer utbildning. Att man gett lite avkall på originaliteten i forskningen. Och det har ju lett till att det blir ett förskjutet fokus mer mot postdoc. Att man tänker att det är mer efter att man har sin doktorsexamen som man börjar forska på allvar och mer originellt. Skulle man förändra processen så att den blir så schemalagd med halvårsuppföljningar, då tror jag att man tar ett ytterligare steg i den riktningen. Då kan man ju också kanske minska ner tiden. Det gäller ju att liksom släppa ut folk så att det blir riktig forskning också.
Skulle ett sådant förfarande påverka vilka som tillåts bli doktorander, disputera och slutligen bli postdoc-forskare?
Det kan tänkas att jag tror att många som passar för forskning är lite originella, lite ovanliga. Och sätter man in dem i en sån strömlinjeformad process så kanske det inte faller väl ut. att man kan på något sätt kasta ut barnet med badvattnet på något sätt.
So there's been terrible supervision in the past, so we need therefore to improve the system, and the way they've improved the system is put in all these checks and balances and changes and everything. But things get lost in that process, and the things that get lost are partly that sense of responsibility that the student used to have. I used to get my students through, and sometimes they would be slow starting, sometimes they'd be quick starting, and I used to say to students, if after the first year you're still confused about what you're doing, it's all right, because we'll find a way through. We will find a way through by year 3 to full-time student. But if they spend the first year just getting confused, that's okay. I reassure them. I can't reassure them of that now, because at the end of year 1 they must go to a committee to present what their thesis will look like and get that approved. Before I take on students now, depending on where it is in the medical school, sometimes there is a requirement to have that blueprint of what the student will do before they even start. So I quite like the student to sort of feel their way into the most interesting question here, but that isn't allowed now. You must know exactly. It's much more formulaic, it's much more designed, which is a loss to the creative potential that a lot of students have, because they must go through these hoops. So I think it is a loss, but then we have an expression in England about being a grumpy old man. When you get old, you get grumpy and bad-tempered. Maybe I'm a grumpy old man because these changes have occurred, and I just, reflecting back on a golden age that never was.
Several experienced supervisors see a risk that the tighter control of the PhD education may make it harder for the original personalities. These people may instead choose a different career, something that in the long term may have negative consequences. One concern is that the change in PhD education rewards students with basic, predictable ideas in front of students with more original and unpredictable ideas. Is that so?
In the UK, all universities are assessed for their research output, and PhD completions are one aspect of that output. And the more PhD completions that the university has, then the higher its rating in terms of research, or it's one of the factors that determines its research rating. So as far as the institution is concerned, they see it as important in an esteem way, but also in a financial way, to ensure that PhD completions are regular. In other words, we keep them going, and that they occur in as short a time as possible. We're certainly under a lot of pressure now to get PhD students to completion. Projects need to be more, more achievable, rather than doing a piece of pure research which may perhaps not produce anything at the end of it. It may be blue skies research. Now we're forced to identify problems and to make sure that questions are much more predictable. And I think this can lead to lower quality research, in the sense that we're asking research questions where we almost already know the answer, in order to make sure that the question is answerable.
Om man skulle roa sig med att jämföra de universitet som har det systemet att man får ett bra utfall för varje som disputerar, jämfört med de universitet som inte får. Tror du att det påverkar lite vilken slags doktorander man väljer att anta?
Ja, det tror jag. Alltså det låter ju hemskt. men det är klart att man vill ha sådana doktorander som snabbt går igenom.
I think what I've learned over the years is, first of all, to take just good students, So that's one thing I've learned, to be selective about the students you accept, because a student who's not so good can really drain you of time and energy, and can really take a lot of your time up if they're not so good and they're struggling. Whereas a good student, if you select the right student with the right skills, and the right attributes and the right motivation and the right project, they can do very well and often complete their PhD without needing a lot of input from the supervisor. So my experience has been over the years to become more strict about who we accept and be more rigid about accepting. If I take a student on, we look at their CV, their personal statement they've written, and then interview them as well to make sure they're suitable and the project they want to do fits in with our research areas. So clearly if someone came with a project that seemed very good but didn't fit in with our research areas, we would not take that student on, no matter how good the project. But it's very clear from the early communication that person isn't going to be suitable, so actually they don't even apply. Of those who apply, around 25 or so, maybe about 1 in 4 we might accept. As I mentioned, in some ways it's the selection that's very important, so I think any university wanting to establish a PhD programme should think very carefully. It's very tempting to take on lots of students because you think, well, that's good for your department. You have a lot of PhD students, they increase the size of your departments, you can do more research, they bring in income. But I think my advice would be to be selective about students and just take good students because they're good for you and they're good for the department, and it's good for them too if their project proceeds smoothly. So that's been the lesson I've learned, I think, is to be very selective about who we take on here in this department.
Yes, I think it has to, whatever the right type, you have to, find a student. I think you have to be sure that the student is fully aware of the implications of doing a PhD. I think it is a huge amount of work. And while it's fascinating, it's also all-absorbing. And I think the student really has to be aware of how much space, intellectual and otherwise, it's going to occupy. I think you have to be sure that they've got the intellectual capability to do it. And perhaps most importantly, the motivation to do it. Why do they want to do this piece of work? Is it going to be worth it for them personally and professionally? Because if not, they're just going to find it incredibly difficult.
That you really make sure that the student has the commitment and the ability to do the project early. More recently, I think postgraduate students have become less willing to spend time out of hours doing their work, and I think that's disappointing. And I think that maybe my age, but I think the work ethic that people bring to some of these research projects now is rather less strong than it was 10 years ago.
To be quite honest, I don't have a lot of time for PhD supervision. Right. So I'm very selective in who I take and what subjects that I need I need to look at. I don't want to spend 3 years of my life with somebody I find very difficult.
If it is so important to choose the right PhD student who always gets done on time and always is pleasant, what about those who does not fit? Would Einstein fit into the current system? Om en ung Albert Einstein hade försökt att bli antagen som doktorand vid Göteborgs universitet med väldigt vilda idéer, hade han blivit det?
Ja, det tror jag. Om man hittar en handledare som tror på honom eller på idéerna. Men du har rätt i det att det måste finnas en beredskap i organisationen och miljön för att ta sig an idéer. Jag vet inte hur vilka idéer du tänker, men jag tror att Albert Einstein skulle ha lyckats idag också.
Well, it's the danger, isn't it, that if you have somebody who's truly creative, that you miss it because they may not conform to a given type.
Yes. What do you think?
Well, I think it is a danger. It's interesting to know. Did Isaac Newton do a PhD? It certainly wouldn't have done one in the sense that we regard it. And I guess, I think there is a discipline to a PhD which goes beyond. It's not vital to do research to do a PhD. I think there's something about the discipline of doing research, of doing a PhD, which is about being able to prove to yourself and your peers that you've got the ability to go through all the stages systematically, and this bound volume, I'm interested that yours is smaller, but the point is that you end up with a product which demonstrates that you've been through all of that and within a particular time scale. And that is a disciplined piece of work that I think probably it's reasonable to select people who are likely to succeed. And you might miss out a few geniuses, but they'll find their way, because they always do. Despite us, we're institutional. They're...
Einstein might not have been acceptable. I know that one of the most highly cited qualitative study within medicine is stigma. I've come across Goffman. Goffman wrote a book, an American anthropologist called Goffman wrote a book called Stigma 50 years ago, and it's still available in print. You can buy the book, which brought the first time the idea of stigma, the idea that patients can be stigmatized by the illnesses they have. Patients with epilepsy or diabetes or sexually transmitted illness can feel stigmatized, and it's a very important book, that. And this concept, you might not have heard of Goffman, but you know the word stigma, because we know it in medicine. We try not to stigmatize people. Mental illness is stigmatizing. How can we avoid stigmatizing people? So this is a concept which has become so important. But if you look at Goffman's original work, there's no methods in there. It's not really very good in terms of how he describes what he did, but it has been a very influential book. So I now sit on grant-giving bodies, giving out research grants. And I often say, well, if Goffman came to us now, we would not fund his research, because he doesn't have a method, he doesn't have an idea, and he's going to go in there and see what he can find, and we wouldn't fund him, which is terrible, really, because he came up with such a brilliant idea, which has been so influential. But that's, that's progress.
Forskning är ju också att vilja ägna sig åt sitt ämne och inte låta ovidkommande saker andra ska få lägga sig för mycket i det, utan det är en slags självständighet som är en ådra som är stark för många, som lyser igenom. Inte annan bråte ska liksom lägga sig i vägen och förhindra min väg. Och blir det för mycket sånt, pekpinnar och måsten och sånt där, då det är många känsliga själar, tror jag också, som säger att då får det vara så.
Innebär det att doktorander som antogs förr inte längre skulle accepteras idag?
Ja, det tror jag. Jag tror det. Jag tror att man är, absolut att man är, och där tror jag nog att det kan vara ibland en fördel, så att man var allt för lätt för att anta. Det gick allt för snabbt, man såg inte riktigt till alla tänkbara hinder som kunde ligga i framtiden och brydde sig så mycket om det. Men samtidigt så missar man en hel del på detta smala hål som man ska igenom för att så att säga bli antagen.
Har du någon fundering på vad kan det få för konsekvenser för vilken typ av forskare vi har om 20 år?
Ja, jag tror det blir små fyrkantiga moduler som kommer ut på något sätt. Den här lite självständiga som kommer på med nya saker, de vänder när de ser att det här får jag inte göra som jag vill. Och det är ju de som är ändå potentialen till väldigt mycket av förändring och nytt och nyskapande. Så att det är ett stort hot, tycker jag, i detta.
Isaac Newton eller Albert Einstein hade försökt bli antagen som doktorand idag vid Göteborgs universitet. Tror du att de hade blivit antagna?
Nej, jag tror det inte. Jag menar, det är ju det är verkligen tillspetsat så, ja. Nej, det måste ju finnas en öppning för dessa begåvningar och skarpa sinnen och nytänkare. Och det gör det inte riktigt, tycker jag. Utan om man ska ha gått grundkursen och man ska ha gjort det och man ska ha gjort si och så. De tröttnar på vägen och gör någonting annat. De hoppar till näringslivet istället kanske.
After listening to these interviews, a few questions appear. There are no obvious answers, but the questions are well worth a discussion. The first question: can the higher volume of the PhD students compensate for the loss of original personalities with breakthrough ideas? The second question: is it possible to identify the original personalities and offer them customized PhD education?